Welcome to the Behavior Speak podcast. Now, here's your host, Ben Ryman.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to say that I'm grateful to be living and working in Etham, on Sayayin, on the traditional lands of the Tla'amin, Kalahus, Homoko, and Comox First Nations, who lived as one people without borders before the colonizers made first contact and eventually stole their land. I have had the wonderful privilege and honor to learn from the Tla'amin peoples about the history of Sayayin, including Kotheeshkan, where for thousands of years a large civilization dwelled there, with evidence of one hearth being used by generations for over 2 millennia, and an ancient tree that still stands there today with evidence of the pitch the peoples used to bind materials. I also learned about Shetekwan, the mountain I can see from my home, which is an important spiritual place. Thanks, everybody. Emote. Welcome to another episode of the Behavior Speak podcast. I'm your host, Ben Ryman, and excited to have my guest from the opposite corner of North America in Florida. As I speak here up in Northwest British Columbia, we have Dr. Kim Crosland in on the podcast today with us. Welcome.
Hi, welcome.
Kim.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
So awesome. So we're going to be talking to Kim today about some really cool things in terms of sort of the application of ABA and PBS in areas of things like runaways and homelessness and other kind of really, necessary areas that, that's not the right word, areas where I think our science could do a lot of good, and it would be wonderful for other folks to kind of, get into this area and really start kind of doing our work to help some of our most vulnerable folks. So I always like to start, Kim, with just a bit of an origin story for folks, kind of how folks kind of got into the field, and kind of eventually kind of got to their where they are today. So if you want to kind of tell us your story.
Sure. So, I kind of fell into behavior analysis, kind of like probably most of the people or a lot of people in the field, where I lived in Pennsylvania and ended up moving to the Baltimore area after I graduated with my undergraduate degree in psychology. And since you can't do a whole lot with an undergrad degree in psychology, I was looking for potential job opportunities. We moved to Baltimore because of my future husband's job, and I found Kennedy Krieger Institute and ended up getting a job there on the neurobehavioral unit there, and was working there as a behavior data specialist. Started as that, and then kind of worked my way up there, and that's where I kind of was first introduced to behavior analysis. Was on the inpatient unit with kids with really severe behavior problems, aggression, self-injury, and so forth. First time I ever heard about a functional analysis or assessment, was able to do that there. And so that kind of got me involved in learning about behavior analysis. And then I worked with some faculty there at the time. So Dr. Wayne Fisher and Dr. Zarconi. And so Jennifer Zarconi ended up going out to the University of Kansas and taking a position there and said, you ought to come back to school. So that's what I did. So I ended up going back and getting my master's and Ph.D. at the University of Kansas. And at that time, when I went to Kansas, it was pretty cool because I got to take some courses with Don Baer, Mont Wolf, Jan Sheldon, Jim Sherman, a variety of like big wigs in behavior analysis. Yeah. So that was pretty awesome. Got to work out there and was working on a grant out there, actually, when I moved out there. My actual advisor was Steve Schroeder, who was doing a lot of biobehavioral work at the time. And he had a huge R01 grant that was evaluating the medication risperidone for SIB and aggressive behaviors. And he had a subcontract related to that with functional analysis. And so I worked on that, where we went out and did individual sessions every week with those that were enrolled in this. It was a randomized controlled trial, double-blind study. And we were doing functional analysis sessions to see if we saw changes in function of problem behavior throughout that medication study. And so it was pretty interesting. We actually did for some of the participants. It would reduce maybe one function, but not another, and so forth. So I was out in Kansas, got my master's PhD there, and then ended up moving to Florida because I made my husband move to Kansas, so he got to choose where we move next. So he was tired of the Kansas weather, so ended up in Florida. He likes to sail, that kind of stuff. So ended up in Florida, and when I came to Florida, there was a huge program going on at the time to implement behavior analysis across the state of Florida in child welfare. And so that's what I started doing when I came to Florida. I was a behavior analyst on that project, and working with families and training families in a curriculum that was developed, the parenting tools curriculum, to help foster parents manage problem behaviors of kids that come into their home. And then worked on that project for several years, and then ended up getting a faculty position at University of South Florida and continued some of that work, did some of the Runaway stuff that we'll talk about. And that's kind of where I've been having fun in Florida.
Wow, that's a good story. So again, I say again, but you haven't heard this yet. but I say this. I've said this to a few of my American guests who sort of talk about, the typical way of kind of getting into the field, which is so much different than a lot of us from other countries, because we don't have access to these these institutions that are super behavior analytic, like Kennedy Krieger and and other, some of these other kind of big ones that are down in the States and have all these super famous ABA gurus working at them. Don't get me wrong, I love my Canadian behavior analysts, but usually for us it seems to be sort of it's all about sort of this autism funding kind of pathway that leads folks into sort of RBT / therapist land, and then eventually kind of into either a BCBA or eventually a Ph.D. and kind of teaching at school. And so to kind of hear the stories of folks that are just get to go and I got to hang out with Mont Wolf and Don Bear and I'm like, hate you folks. And never getting that exposure. And I do hear, and I've interviewed a couple of folks from like over in Africa and Egypt that came over to the States and got to have sort of those similar experiences that you've had, which were really, really kind of interesting. So I think that's kind of neat. I think the other piece that I think some folks, that are listening sort of, from, other parts of the world, may or may not be aware of, sort of Florida was, kind of one of the early sort of, I guess, I don't know if I'm saying this right, but sort of early states to kind of really get into ABA. I think that's just sort of where, ABAI kind of started, was sort of from the state association in Florida.
Yeah, because they had they had a certification, a Florida state certification that's still there are some behavioral analysts that still have that here, never got the national certification. Yeah.
Right. That was sort of the precursor to the BACB and those sorts of things. And so to hear that Florida has a statewide child welfare program that wants to use ABA, anyone else sort of on the planet is like, how do we get our government to want ABA into a program like this, And so to hear that is again, we're just like, oh.
Yeah.
Like we're just going to be mild. We're going to be years away before we can, before some government person is going to go, hey, we need ABA in our child welfare field. And so just hearing kind of these stories is in some ways I'm jealous, but in other ways it's just great to see that work is being done and that the research is being done. The other piece that struck me, and I'm already forgetting what it was, but maybe it was. I think it was that Florida piece, but also just kind of moving right into sort of from some of these great places, and then into that sort of professorship to kind of continue that work is awesome. In terms of kind of foster care, this is a bit of a new area for me, not so much foster care itself, but just kind of having the agency that I work for is starting to get a lot more referrals for people in foster care, and and we're really unsure kind of what to do and kind of how to approach it. And often foster care situations are not always lengthy, and so you've got someone placed in there and you immediately get kind of challenging behavior just as a result of sort of being removed from their home and put into an unknown environment
right.
with, people they don't know and all those sorts of things. So it's not surprising that, your foster care research kind of went from, training staff to, deal with challenging behavior to, the work around kind of, kids kind of running out of foster care and leaving foster care. Cause I can imagine it's hard to sort of, you know, you know, set up a foster home that's gonna make a kid want to stay there.
Right. Yeah, there's a really good video too called Removed, when you mentioned Removed, that I ended up showing to my students in class, because there's a lot of things that it helps you kind of think about the traumatic experiences that kids in child welfare may have endured, and how you might kind of change how you view that and how you go in as a behavior analyst. Things aren't always as straightforward. Sometimes it's a little more difficult to figure out maybe what the function of a problem behavior is, because it's related to some type of traumatic event that occurred for that particular child. So there's a really good video that shows some of the problem behaviors that might occur and maybe why, related to kids who are removed and put into different environments. But we were doing both group training with foster parents and also working individually with foster parents and biological parents. We would have some of them come into some of our trainings too, who were trying to get their kids back. And so we were teaching them skills, and we call them tools. So the tools for positive behavior change. And they involved kind of basic behavior analytic procedures. So stay close. How do you develop a relationship with a child? What do you do to do that? There's steps you might do. Use reinforcement, set expectations, which involve a variety of differential reinforcement type procedures in those trainings. And so we were doing those statewide related to the program. And now, even though that statewide program, because of budget cuts, got actually cut, there are still behavior analysts working in the different child welfare agencies across the state of Florida. So I still have a lot of contact with those folks who are still out there doing some work. But when we were doing that program, which is kind of how we got into kids running away, is back in 2008, 2009, the state of Florida had a huge issue with missing children. And it happened because there was, I think, one or two kids ended up being found dead in the streets or whatever. And they weren't doing a good job of making sure where kids were. And they were having a lot of issues of kids running away from placements. And so that's where a number of folks were working on how can we develop something to help improve services and decrease kids running away from foster care. And so that's where there was an original kind of survey or questionnaire developed, because one of the problems with running away is conducting a functional assessment is really not possible in the normal sense, because we can't see them when they run to know what's the antecedent, what's the consequence, where are they running to, what are they accessing, why did they run, what's the environment before. So instead of trying to figure out from a standard FAA perspective, we said, well, let's develop a questionnaire and talk to kids when they come back from running away and see if we can figure out the function based on certain questions we ask of kids when they return. And so we developed a questionnaire. So we had a brief questionnaire that behavior analysts were conducting in foster care. So a kid would come back from running away. They'd sit down and talk with that kid. And the behavior analyst kind of knows the kind of questions to ask to get it function. But what we were interested in as well, most child welfare agencies can't afford behavior analysts to come in and do this. So can we figure out a way to develop a assessment or a questionnaire, and then also interventions that would be matched on to what the results of the questionnaire were, and figure out a way to do this so that direct care staff or caregivers or case managers in foster care can actually do this on their own with little or some support from a behavior analyst. And that's kind of what my research was involved in. And we got, so I submitted and got a federal grant through Department of Education in the U.S. So it's called the Institute of Education Sciences. And they were interested because one of the things with kids who are running away is they're not attending school and they're not having good educational outcomes. Their outcomes are really poor. So if we can get them to stay in their placement, we can improve their educational outcomes. So they funded a development grant to try to develop this intervention. And that's where, during that development process, we ran a number of focus groups, which as a behavioral analyst, that was all new to me. I have qualitative people that help me on my grants to run kind of focus groups to get information on how do we ask certain questions, what type of questions do we ask. And we ran these with caseworkers, teachers, and also with youth themselves. And so we got youth who were currently in the system and also youth who had aged out and were runners when they were in the system. And those were actually the youth that provided a lot of good information for us about how do we talk to kids when they come back from running away so that they'll answer our questions and so that they'll be open to telling us what's going on and that sort of thing and what kinds of interventions might actually work. And so we got a lot of that information in, and then that's how we also developed the intervention guide. So we kind of had this intervention guide that matches onto when we determine the function. There's a whole interview questionnaire when kids come back, and we don't just say, okay, well, so why'd you run away? We ask questions like, what are the good things that happen when you're on the run? What are the things that aren't so good when you're on the run? So that we can kind of figure out what are the reinforcers they're accessing. Are they running away to see a boyfriend or girlfriend? Are they running away to have fun, do something cool, do drugs, whatever? And then once we can figure that out, or are they running away because they hate their current placement? Once we figure that out, then we can figure out, well, what kind of intervention can we match onto that function that might be successful in getting them to stay put in a location, in a foster home or a group home, and get them to stay there and be more successful. And so that's kind of what we've been working on for, it's been like 10 years now. We've been doing a variety of things. We also got another grant at SBIR. So it's a Small Business Innovation Research Grant to try to get all of that information into an online format so that it could be used on a tablet. So an interviewer can go out and have all that information on a tablet or laptop, whatever, and be able to answer all the questions there and have it latch on and give them suggestions. Because I think that's one of the hardest things. I think it's the hardest thing for anybody is, okay, you figure out the function of the problem behavior. How do you match the intervention to function? And so that's really what we're trying to work with case managers and caseworkers to try to figure that out when they're working with kids who are running away. How do we develop effective interventions? Because the go-to seems to be, well, let's just punish. Let's just make them sleep on a bed in the main room so they can't run away, or let's take away points or whatever. And we know those things don't work. Those actually most likely increase the chances of them running away again. So, that's what we're working on. And we currently have a small project we're starting back up for the state of Florida. I've been meeting with them over the past few months where they're trying to implement this in Orlando and a couple other areas and actually have the caseworkers implement the runaway model or intervention and see if we can get it to work with them. Because so far, we've only done it with behavior analysts like support. We are going to provide some support to them at monthly meetings to try to help them brainstorm if they're struggling with intervention development and so forth once they interview youth when they come back from running away. But that's really the plan is for them to go out and be able to potentially do this on their own. And then we'll try to get some more funding to support it.
Wow, really cool. You touched on a lot of things which I want to unpack a little bit. One thing initially, and it wasn't really something we talked about in the pre-chat, but it's something that you said that resonates for me, and I've struggled with a lot. And it's this whole behavior analysts cost too much bit, which, and they absolutely do. I mean, that's not a bit. I mean, we are expensive, and certainly more expensive depending on where you go. And it just seems, I don't really know what the question is here, but it just seems sort of ridiculous to me, and I'm soapboxing for a second here, but it seems sort of ridiculous to me that, we're in a helping profession, a social services type field where we work directly with folks. Generally speaking, social services did not equate to, wealth,
right,
for folks that work in it. When I finally became a homeowner, I felt like, how is it possible that we're in social services and we own a home? With sort of the piddly funding that we tend to get for the kind of work we do, but it just seems so strange to me that we've got a system set up in such a way that we get paid lots and lots of money to do this stuff, but no one can afford us. So what's the point of us except to sort of pass our skills on to someone else, like you're doing in some of your work? But then, of course, we get a lot of flack for than not including a behavior analyst anymore, and so on and so forth. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? It just it's frustrating to me, but I don't know if there's an answer. I think also because I'm in an area, and this is by no means a sort of slam on my company, but I'm in there. I don't make I don't make the kind of money that I see some behavior analysts in the States making, which is fine. And I didn't get into this field to make money. I'm middle class. I have a modest income. I'm happy with what I'm doing. But I definitely could charge probably twice as much as what my company kind of currently bills for services. But we don't, because we want people to be able to access our services. And I just don't know what the answer
Yeah, it's
is.
unfortunate. I don't know what the answer is either. I know that in the States, it's one of the biggest issues is around insurance and billing for services. And right now, in most of the states, the only way to bill for behavioral like services is under an autism diagnosis or related disability diagnosis. And that was one of the issues in foster care too, was when Mike Stoddemore started the program, the statewide program, he was working in foster care, but he was working with kids with disabilities because that was the only way that there was funding to support behavioral like services, because they could bill for that. But then he was seeing that there were so many other kids that needed our services that couldn't access them because they had emotional and behavior disorders, but they didn't have autism or developmental disabilities. And that's why he was kind of promoted, hey, how can we do this so that it might be feasible, which is why they developed kind of a group-based training, thinking it would be a little bit more cost-effective. Can we train a lot of parents, foster parents, in a group setting to do well and support a lot of kids? So any kid that comes into their home would have a parent that was trained in how best to work with them, and that might be a more cost-effective, method of doing it for kids, and also better for kids in the system that were running into or getting placed into different homes. But yeah, I don't know if there's a good answer to that, because I think it still exists in the States where child welfare agencies cannot afford to have very many behavior analysts. And oftentimes behavior analysts aren't used the way we should be either, even in the school system, is that we're used to kind of put out fires instead of from an antecedent perspective. Yeah. Yeah.
No, 100%. Yeah. Anyway, and just kind of that point kind of got me, but I'm glad that you're able and I'm glad that there are sort of, programs or not necessarily programs, but, academics, like yourself, that are able to sort of access kind of those additional funds so that, some of these groups are able to get this kind of training with which they normally, probably wouldn't be able to sort of afford on their own. So I think that's probably one way I guess we can mitigate things is through those grants and through those sorts of things. But it does set up that barrier.
And we're trying to help some of the group facilities locally with how they could better or figure out different ways to bill so that they can provide behavioral like services. One of the group homes locally that I work with, a residential facility in foster care, they found out some ways that they can actually they've hired 2 behavior analysts and have been able to bill successfully to support them. So I think there are ways around it. I think people just don't know how to do it. And I'm sure it's a lot different where you are than it is in the States. Yeah.
Yeah, I almost wonder if folks need to have, and again, it's hard to sort of speak for other people and their living situations and where that, I live in a rural area where the cost of living is relatively low and so on and so forth. Whereas, in the bulk of our behavior analysts are in big cities where the cost of living is really high. So sort of suggest to them that they should have like a sliding scale of rate, not be doable if in order to survive. I know there's, and I'll move off from this in a second, but I know just one example of a person that was moving from one agency to our company because they had to have a caseload of something like 75 kids or something.
Oh my gosh.
Because the funding was so low, and it took 75 kids for them to make a middle class salary. Insane. So that was sort of the ridiculousness of it all. But kind of moving on from that, I won't get down to some of sort of the nitty gritty of some of the studies and kind of what you found, but I'm curious sort of what was sort of the perspective or sort of these kids, were these kids eager to kind of speak to you?
So that's a good question. So I think it varied. So the kids who had aged out and we got to come back in and to our focus groups, they were actually very eager to talk with us. I think because they felt like they might be able to make a difference for those kids who are currently in foster care. So what they're saying and help and telling us might actually affect and help somebody else. So I think they were definitely more open to it. The kids who are currently in foster care, they seem to be open to sharing, but they really did have a rough time. Some of them like trying to discuss what might work because things just weren't going well. And so it was hard for them to kind of think about, well, what might work better? What might we do to better support you? They could definitely complain and tell us what wasn't going well, but it was hard for them to kind of take the perspective of, well, maybe this would help or this could be done better. But it was helpful for us to hear what wasn't going well so that we could get an idea of what we might better do to support them. Yeah.
And so what we're kind of, I mean, obviously when and I kind of read this in some of the earlier studies you did around sort of when you were first kind of, these might have been these focus group studies where you're sort of trying to get sort of initial idea. And generally speaking, I think I read in a couple of the papers, the reasons kids were running away were either to get away, which makes sense, to get away from something in that foster home environment. Actually, before I go on, is all your work been around runaways from foster care, or has this been runaways from home as well?
Pretty much from foster care settings. So it can be from residential settings, but kids that are in foster care, yes. Now, it doesn't mean that this wouldn't necessarily apply to kids who aren't in foster care, but I think there could be other nuances with kids who aren't in foster care as to why they're running away. So but all of this work has been specific to kids in foster care.
And actually, I kind of just thought of this, but do you know if there's sort of stats on, do kids, when we hear about kids running away, are they mostly running from foster care, or are there a lot of kids running away from home? We hear running away from home as a phrase, but I don't know. I never hear about kids actually doing it.
Yeah, there are a lot of kids who run away from regular home situations. I think kids in foster care are probably, I think they're about 3 times more likely to run away than kids who aren't in foster care.
Oh, interesting.
So there is a much higher percentage of kids running away that are in foster care. But kids do. I mean, teenagers will run away from regular home placements.
Yeah, fair enough. So with that, kind of going back to the question I was starting to phrase, was basically they're either trying to escape that foster home situation or maybe the family home situation. So there's something about it they want to get away from, or they want to get to something. And I think that those are kind of the sort of the sort of general categories. And that's really, I think that's sort of the most behavior analysts out there will know that, most elopement type behavior is related to one of those two things. Although actually I should say that I think a lot of folks just think about the leaving and don't think about the accessing as sort of being part of that. But it's not always about getting away from the math worksheet. Sometimes it's just about getting to the playground. And so but with these folks and with kind of the work you're doing, what were there kind of some common sort of more specific kind of things that folks were trying to kind of reasons for running away?
Well,
functions?
I mean, what I'll tell you is that I would say the majority of the kids they were running for for multiple reasons, both to escape an aversive environment that they were currently in, and also to access something that they couldn't in that environment. So it seemed like there was typically most kids had multiple functions going on. And so when we did the interview, we have a part towards the end of the interview where we kind of have them rank what's most important, since they may have there might be more than one function, so that we kind of know what to start with, what to start kind of addressing at first, and then try to address the rest. And sometimes everything is addressed by one thing. But yeah, they're running away from a group home setting that they hate. They don't like the caregivers. They don't like something about the setting. They're accessing friends. They might, in fact, and this is one thing that's a lot different than kids who run away from biological homes, is that a lot of these kids are running to their biological families. So it might not be that they're good for them, but they're the only family they know, and they're running toward 2 people in their biological family. And so that may happen. They may be running for girlfriend, boyfriends. They may be running to access drugs. So there's kind of a variety of things that we've seen. And we really did struggle with, well, can we actually be successful for kids who are running to access, drugs and alcohol or something like that? But in quite a few cases, we were. It's a matter of, when you interview the kids about finding out. I mean, I can give you a good example if you want.
Yeah,
okay.
please.
So we had this one kid who was living in a group facility, and he was running away multiple times, and we got him back and interviewed him. So one of the behavior analysts on our team interviewed him. And during the interview, this kid literally pulls out wads of cash. And so,
oh my gosh.
And he pretty much like divulges his entire life story, which was just insane. He his parents were involved in a drug ring, basically. And so he was born into this drug ring. And his father had been murdered, and his mother was in prison. And the rest of his family was still involved in this. And he pretty much, it was kind of like, you were born into the family. It's something you have to do, kind of thing. And so he basically had a job that was covering up him leaving to go be able to sell drugs and whatever else. And so he'd leave to go to this construction job, but he was really actually selling drugs and making a lot of money and so forth. But in the interview, the interesting thing was that he commented that, he didn't want to end up like his dad or his mom. It wasn't something that he wanted to happen. He knew he kind of had to do this, but it really wasn't what he was wanting to do. And so in the interview, we're like, well, what is it that you are interested in doing? And he had this dream of owning a landscaping company. Which is insane.
Wow.
Yeah, he really wanted a landscaping company. This is something he was interested in. Like, all right. And so when the behavior analyst who interviewed him came back and talked to us, we're like, my God, how are we going to compete with all this money? Like, dude, this kid can get, whatever he wants with all this money. So what we did was set up a brief behavior contract with him, like to stay put for a little bit while we worked on trying to get him in order to own a company in the United States and probably anywhere, you kind of have to have some ID. Like he didn't have a driver's license yet. He didn't have his GED. He had kind of dropped out of school, so he wanted to go back and get it. So we were able to get him into GED classes, able to get him identification. And then fortunately, the group facility that he was at was willing to work with us and said, well, we can pay him to do some landscaping at our facility. So we got him to do that, which got him to stay put. He was doing some landscaping there. We were surprised that he still hadn't run, but he didn't. And then so he was doing landscaping there and ended up aging out of the system. And the system here in Florida is insane. They actually put him, when he aged out, he went back into an apartment right where he used to live and was selling drugs. But was smart enough to say, I'm not going to do this. He saw one of his other friends get arrested. And he, at the time, his girlfriend at the time was pregnant, and he was going to be a father. He would have been like 19, 20 at the time after he aged out. He hadn't run away since we started working with him. He got his GED. Yeah. And he figured that wasn't a good place for him to live, so he moved. And he was still doing landscaping for the group home. So they were paying him. So he had gotten that contract. And I think he got another contract for landscaping too, and ended up buying his own, I think, mower and some other equipment and so forth. Amazing. So he was actually one of the amazing success stories that we didn't think we'd be successful with. I actually met him once when I was out at that group facility. He came up, showed me a picture of his adorable baby, and was so excited about his family and so forth. So you can actually change even when you don't think that you might make a difference where we're really difficult. You can actually compete with some of that stuff, which we didn't think we would when it comes to drugs or money and that sort of thing. So he was definitely a successful story. I think he's still doing well. I haven't been in contact with him for a little while, but yeah. So that's one of the kids. But with a number of kids that we've had very similar situations where once we were able to figure out, what do they want in their life situation? How do they want things changed, and how can we make that difference? And it might be changing a placement. If we can, sometimes we can't. It depends on the foster care agency. If we can figure out a different placement, we've had one girl, she wanted to be placed just with a single mother because she had been sexually abused by a man in her life before. And so we were able to get her a placement with a mom who was trained in the behavior curriculum I mentioned earlier. And she did really well there, never ran away from that placement after we changed it. There's just a variety of things. It just really depends. Some are much more difficult. We had one girl who was running to access older men who we can't allow. Sometimes we can set up a situation where, yes, you can access a boyfriend or girlfriend if they're age appropriate and make that happen. Yeah. But this girl was running to older men. And so instead for her, we tried to figure out what other activities that might compete with that. And she had played volleyball before, and we were able to get her back into playing volleyball, which helped to compete with that and get her doing something else instead of, running to see men. So it really just, it depends on the function and what you can do to compete with some of those things if you can't actually offer what it is that the function of the behavior is related to. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, and it totally made sense. Absolutely. And it's a great story, I think, because it, I think it speaks to, us. It kind of goes back to sort of some biases and assumptions that we're gonna make about sort of this population of kids. Like they're, it kind of makes me think of that recent, Pat Fryman paper, on kids being bad, right? And all kids are bad, and runaways are bad. They're bad kids, and they'll never change, and there's no hope. Well, and of course, it's that attitude that keeps them in the system for the rest of their life, and eventually in prison. And so it makes me think about sort of you mentioned briefly when you were kind of talking about sort of moving towards more of the interview side of things, and you really had to kind of you had to bring in the qualitative kind of research piece. This is something I've been hearing more and more about lately from other folks, that they're starting to introduce, not in the context of research, but just in the context of general assessment. They're starting to introduce some more of these kind of qualitative methods for, either assessing behavior and assessing situations, and I know there's a lot of them out there, and they've got lots of funky names that I can't repeat, but as far as sort of the structure of some of those interviews, but there seems to be a bit more of a push now for hearing people's stories.
Yeah. We actually submitted it for a symposium related to qualitative research and how we can use that within some of the work that we do as behavior analysts with some folks from Debbie Napolitano from New York, and Cynthia Anderson out of May. Because a number of different projects are doing qualitative work, and they're using that information for the quantitative work that we do. How do we use that information to make what we do, better, and support what it is that we do as behavior analysts?
Yeah, totally. And so did you find that you needed to do like a lot of sort of rapport building with these kids before they started answering these questions, or were they keen to kind of just jump right in and tell you their stories?
That's a good question, because we thought we would, but in general we didn't. As long as because, and it could have been because we were outside people from we weren't their case manager, we weren't living with them. We came in as a behavioral analyst, so we came in very open-minded. We definitely taught our behavioral analyst interview skills and how to reflect back, how to use empathy statements, a variety of things that a lot of behaviorists really aren't taught. How do you interview somebody? So we taught those skills so that our behavior analysts that were interviewing, they were never judgmental in the interview, things like that would get kids to talk. And in general, kids were very open to talking with us. But we're also trying to figure out a way to incorporate within the actual overall runaway intervention is how do we decide who interviews the kid? Because, we were outside people, but now that if I'm trying to get caseworkers or case managers to go in and interview, well, we need to make sure that person has a reasonable relationship, a good enough relationship with them to do the interview, and that their interview skills are there. So because if they're going to be judgmental and just say things, back to the youth, then the youth will close up and not actually talk with them. So it's certainly something to consider, and that we're trying to figure out better ways to develop. Well, part of our training for the runaway intervention model is interviewing skills and how we interview. And we've created some videos that show kind of a good interview and a bad interview and some things from the bad interview that you might want to avoid, and having them look at that in our training.
If you're planning on collecting continuing education credits for this episode, you'll need to go to www.cbiconsultants.com/shop and enter the 3 secret words. The first secret word is foster. It's mind-blowing, and I've had this conversation with a few guests now and many others, how that piece is missing from our training. Half of our job is doing assessments and conducting interviews, and yet we aren't taught how to conduct interviews and how to have listening skills. Like like the lack of sort of counseling skills or sort of motivational interviewing
Right.
skills or any of those sorts of pieces from our training is somewhat mind blowing considering the work they expect us to do.
It's true. We definitely need more of it. I'm hoping eventually that's added into some of the curriculums, especially the motivation interviewing pieces. Yep. Because any kind of interview you're doing, whether it's a FAST, a MASS, anything, you should be looking for certain things from that interview and knowing how to ask follow-up questions, because some of that information is extremely important to how we develop our interventions.
Exactly. And then I think those follow-up questions are key. They're, you don't get every single question you should be asking in these forums. These forums are meant to be guides, and really the ideal is that one could just walk into a situation with no piece of paper and just ask the right questions and sort of get those answers. But how do you kind of build those skills for sure? In terms of kind of did you find that the foster homes were obviously you're at times it was accessing girlfriends and boyfriends and things like that, or maybe it was like curfew and or maybe it was or getting to family and blah blah blah. No, but what? But I'm sure you often found there were just things that were wrong with the actual placement when you weren't able to change the placement. And I know that's going to be a really hard thing to do in general. Placements aren't a dime a dozen. It's hard, they're hard to set up. Did you find that foster homes were open to making changes?
I think in general, yes. So foster homes and group homes, we've worked with, we had one girl who she started running away because she wanted to take Lunchables for lunch. And the group home said, no, we can't do that. Like, really, that's it?
Oh, my gosh.
Because she would go to school and people would know she'd have this bag lunch and they'd know she was living at that group home and she didn't, like that. So we worked with them on, can she do some chores to earn Lunchables? And so we set up a situation where she could do some chores, earn Lunchables. They also didn't have a really good rapport with her. So we tried to, we did some training with the staff there on some of the tools that we teach in our curriculum and, to develop a better relationship with her so that she would kind of remain stable. And so she did. She was able to earn Lunchables, and then we ended up finding her a placement that was a little bit better for her, but she had to stay there until we could find a different placement. But in general, I think most of the placements are willing to do their best to rearrange things so that the kids are successful. I think it can be just difficult based on whatever rules or regulations that they feel they might need to follow, even though they may not necessarily actually have to follow those. There's a lot of like regulations statewide around normalization with kids. So kids should be allowed to go out and hang out with friends at the mall, or should be allowed to do whatever. But then some group homes feel like, well, if their eyes aren't on them, then they're running away. And they're not allowed to do that. But that's really not how it's set up. So it's kind of adjusting what different facilities or even foster parents feel that they need to have in place at their homes.
And like, have you done any kind of work to kind of, because this is the barrier I think we run into a lot is exactly that, is that the agency or there isn't even an agency and it's just a foster parent and whatever, and they have sort of these assumptions, that may or may not have any basis. Do you have any luck kind of changing their minds or ways of sort of convincing them to kind of go the other direction?
I mean, I think we have when we've worked with families. It's very individualistic based on that, that home and that kid that's in the home. So I don't have like any like huge group data on what we've been able to do, but I mean, we try to with when we're training them on how to improve their relationship with the kids in their home. We try to do that. It can be difficult. We've tried to change. I mean, which is why behavior analysts should get better training also on kind of systemic or systematic change within systems, because a lot of it is system change. We tried to work with group facilities and changing the entire system. We worked with one group home to try to implement kind of like school-wide behavior support, but we did agency-wide. But it was really difficult because turnover is so high. So staff turnover is so high. So once we train everybody, get them to speed, turnover is high, managers leave, and then we have people who aren't trained anymore. So getting it to sustain has been like nearly impossible at some of these places. So it's something, though, that behavior analysts and most behavior analysts don't know how to do that. They're not trained kind of organizational behavior management or how you change an entire system, how you go top down into a system and rearrange how things are done. And that's really what has to happen at a lot of the locations that we work at.
100%. I mean, and anyone who works in kind of any kind of residential care setting, whether it's foster care or just a group home for folks with developmental disabilities or whatnot, you know, is probably nodding right now about sort of the, you know, the staff constantly quitting and you know, the low pay and the lack of training and, you know, sort of all those pieces that are in place that make and then just the placement itself just not being a good fit in any way, but being the only one available, and so you get that bed regardless.
Exactly, that's just like how it is. You have foster care, group homes, wherever.
Yeah, and so you're right. It's just sort of that systems approach, and it's. You know, it's interesting that you know, maybe there's more work that I'm just not aware of, but we haven't seen a lot. We've seen tons of really good work in the school-wide PBS realm, and you know, and sort of.
And there's been some good work in
thousands of kids.
and there's been some good work in taking that school-wide approach to juvenile justice facilities. But when it comes to foster care, there hasn't been much. There's been a little bit. There's a group in Pennsylvania that's done some things in foster care by taking school-wide PBIS into agencies in foster care. But other than that, I'm not. There might be someone in Arizona too who's doing some of that work, but it's certainly not huge. Yeah, not a whole lot of folks out there doing it.
Yeah. And yet I mean, even sort of just positive behavior support alone, when you say the phrase, you know, schools is what they think of right away. They don't think of sort of any other context anymore. And in fact, I think a lot of folks now are using, you know, are saying they're PBS practitioners when they're not, you know, when they're really just doing ABA, which is a lot of PBS, but they're not doing that systems piece, which I think is you know, they're doing quality of life and all that good stuff, but that systems piece is so huge in PBS, and we don't see enough of that. So I hear you. So the assessments, and I took a look at it. We'll have links to all these in the show notes, and the actual article on the functional assessment interview for Runaways has the whole assessment right there at the back there for folks to kind of use and look and kind of get an idea of, and it's got some great questions. What sort of what were the results like in some of these studies as far as the interventions themselves being successful? So you've done a good assessment. How the outcomes?
Yeah, the outcomes have been really good. So we so for the grant that we had 25 youth that were recruited into the study, and I think it was all but one youth saw reductions in running away. So what we did was we do days on the run, because when it comes to running away, it's not necessarily the frequency of running, it's how many days they're on the run. I mean, frequency does matter, but you can have a kid running 8 times but only be gone one night each night, versus one kid who runs once and is gone 200 days. Well, which kid is probably in more danger? Probably the kid who runs 200 days.
Absolutely.
So we were looking at number of days on the run pre and post intervention. So we looked back on actually a year's worth of data prior to coming into our intervention, and then a year after, and saw really significant reductions in running away. I forget what the P score was or whatever, but it was definitely a significant reduction. All but one of them saw decreases in running away, and the other one remained. That person only had 2 runs before we intervened, and I think she ran maybe twice for a couple of days after, and then stopped running for the one who didn't. But the rest of them, a lot of them decreased from, some of them had 200 days on the run before we intervened, and then decreased down to near 0. And we also looked at placement disruptions, or the number of placement times their placement changed before and after. And those also decreased significantly. And if anybody's interested in the results, I can certainly send you some of the results that we have from that, which we still need to publish. I'm taking forever to get that out. That and the intervention guide we need to publish. But I can certainly send. We have that data out there, and I've presented it at a number of conferences already. Some of that data that we have from that initial study that we did, and then we're doing some more work currently.
I think that's really cool, and I think you make a good point about the sort of the dependent variable, I guess, around number of days. I think yeah, yeah, I think as a foster parent or even as a new behavior analyst, kind of coming into a situation like this and seeing that a kid has run away like 30 times in the year, but maybe only was gone for you know 40 hours
Right.
or whatever. They didn't even run away for a full day. Um, you know, versus kind of looking at the amount of days. I think because I think folks are going to be looking for perfection in some ways. Oh no, they ran away again,
Hmm.
but he only ran away for like a day. But he didn't run. That's not enough. That's not enough time to join a gang
Yeah.
and develop a drug addiction and get someone
Right.
pregnant. So I mean, and all these sorts of other sorts of possible issues that can happen. As kind of time goes on, and so I think just having a different perspective on kind of that outcome and going, okay, they left the house for a day, no biggie relative to sort of getting into some of these other kind of bigger problems. And I think thinking about that way
Yeah.
is
I
really
mean, one of the
important.
difficulties was accessing some of these kids. So it tended to be, unfortunately, that a lot of the kids that were recommended to us or sent to us were the frequent runners that ran for, a couple days at a
Mm,
time, because they're the ones causing trouble in the system, for one thing, because they got to keep finding them placements. And
mhm,
they're there
mhm,
available. Whereas we're waiting for kids to come back who are gone 200 days. And then once they come back, we try to get them quickly. To interview them,
mhm,
but that can also be difficult because the whole informed consent process is that's a huge, and that's another thing that is a huge barrier to doing
mm,
research in foster care, is the informed consent process. So in order to get informed consent from a kid in care, it's really difficult. So if you don't have a biological parent, so if the parental rights are terminated, what we had to do was get consent from the kid and also from the agency, but we also had to have a court order to be able to intervene. When it came to kids who
mm.
still had parental rights, we could go and get biological parents to sign, but it was really a weird situation. It's like we're going to biological parents who don't currently have their kids. We went to jails to get signatures from biological parents so that their kids could
Mm.
potentially be part of the runaway study.
Wow,
Yeah.
yeah.
So what are our plans in the future? What we really want to do, which is what we're doing with this, with the current rollout in Florida, is get the agencies to actually implement this as their practice. If they do it as part of their
Mhm,
practice, then we can get de-identified data back to us as they implement, and then we can avoid
mm,
the informed consent process potentially. Because it is just
mhm,
incredibly
mhm.
difficult, which I understand why there's a lot of things in place to when it comes to research in foster care. But getting informed consent, yeah, is really difficult. So that's one of the
Yeah,
disadvantages. Yeah.
you've got a lot of studies that you know uh, that make me that seem like they would have taken quite a bit of effort to either get consent or get
Oh
past
yeah.
sort of an internal review board or whatnot. I mean, you've done a lot of this work in Runaways and foster care, but you've also done some work, and maybe we can kind of move over to
Sure.
this a bit. As and sort of, so if folks run away and you're not successful, sometimes the outcome is
Hmm.
homelessness. And so I think it's really cool to see that I thought it was really cool to see a few studies by you and colleagues working with the homeless. I mean, I don't even know how you go about doing that beyond when I think of working with the homeless, I think of outreach workers bringing
Yeah.
blankets and making sure things are okay. I think of harm reduction. I think of just encouraging them to go to a shelter and this and that and the other. And often it kind of reminds me. I did an interview recently on someone who was kind of studying kind of drug addiction and the same idea, just sort of, you know, like there's lots of resources available for these folks, but you know, it's convincing them to want to access any
Hmm.
of them. It seems to be the bigger problem. There's lots of shelters, there's lots of helping agencies available. There's lots of drug rehab and the whole nine yards. But you've got to want to kind of get that help. And I think for the folks that are homeless, it's probably really tough there. So what led you to kind of start working with homeless folks?
Well, it was actually one of my master's students who was working for a church. He was highly involved in a church that was providing support to individuals who were homeless. And he really wanted to look at trying to help as much as he could. And how could he bring behavior analysts into doing that? Colin Streetman's his name. And he, and also Rusty Clark, Dr. Rusty Clark, who has done a lot of work in the past related to social problem solving. He came in and presented at one of my courses, and Colin met him, and we all chatted together to try to come up with an idea. And this is where kind of this was basically part of Colin's master's thesis that he did. And so he went out and worked with several individuals who he had contact with who were homeless to do his research, which I was involved in with him. Do you want me to go on to talk about it a little bit? Okay, sure.
Yeah, please.
So, I mean, one thing that we thought is that, individuals who are homeless are probably perhaps making some, poor decision making around a variety of areas, whether it's work life, home life, relationships. And so maybe one thing we could help them with is learning some problem solving skills. And so he found some individuals. So the church that he was working at had subsidized some apartments that would provide some housing for some individuals who were homeless. And so these were individuals who had recurrent times in which they were homeless. They were currently in this apartment setting that was subsidized, that they could stay there as long as they were working or looking for work. And so 2 of them were currently working full part-time, and 1 was seeking employment out of the 3 people that we were working with, 3 men that we were working with. And for them, we thought, they might be able to benefit from some social problem solving. So we used a model called SOTAs, which basically just stands for situation. So first, defining and understanding of current situation. So let's say one of these individuals, or anybody for that matter, has a situation at work where their boss says something and they get mad at their boss. So that might be the situation. So we first define it, figure out what is the situation. And then the O would stand for options. So what are your options in that situation? So you're mad at something your boss said. What could you potentially do? Well, you could yell at your boss. You could, not say anything right then. You could talk and do something else, and whatever your situations might be, or the options might be. And then having them think about, well, what are the advantages and disadvantages? So the D and the A are the disadvantages and advantages, although we like to talk about advantages first. So what are the advantages to any particular option you might choose? So, okay, what's an advantage if you yell at your boss? Well, an advantage is you might get your anger out. Be happy about that. But then what's the disadvantages if you yell at your boss? Well, you might lose your job. That might not go well. So having them, though, brainstorm what the advantages and disadvantages for each of those options are that they come up with, and then coming up with a solution. And so they can pick the solution. And we do this with a lot of youth, too, to work with youth on how to make better decision-making skills. So they may pick the wrong option, and they'll figure out, oh, that's a bad option, because it's not us figuring out for them what they should do. It's more teaching them the skill of trying to think through a situation instead of just, acting right away on a situation. And then it doesn't go well. So it's teaching them kind of a thought process for how you might, instead of just reacting in the moment, what might you do instead? You might think about your options, your advantages, disadvantages of those options, and then come up with what might be the best solution there. And so we trained these 3 participants. And what we did was we trained them to actually facilitate this process with somebody else, with like a friend that they know or another individual who's homeless that they know. So we trained them to do it, hoping that if they learn how to do this for someone else, then they will learn how to do it for themselves. And so we did that so that we could get some data on them actually doing it with us. And so we would act as the individual who had a difficult situation, and they would have to work us through the process of that. So they would ask us, so what is the situation? So what are your options? And they have to stay non-judgmental through the process. What are your advantages, disadvantages? They can't tell us what we're supposed to do. They have to work us through the process to come up with a solution. And so that's how we did our probes for getting data from them to see how they would do it in baseline before we taught them how to do this process, and then how they would do it after we taught them all the steps. So it's basically a checklist of steps that we were teaching them how to do it. And so they did it with us, and we saw that their skills improved up somewhere between like 90, 100%. And then we did a social validity follow-up to see if they were actually using this in their own life. And so what we had them do was fill out one of the SOTAS worksheets each week. We met with them once a week. We said, if you come up to the situation this week, and you use the process. We want you to write it down. Now, of course, sometimes they didn't come to the meeting written down, but we had them write it down in the meeting. And most of them did actually use it for different problems they had. One of the guys really liked it and was using it multiple times throughout the course of the week for a different situation he was in. And so that actually helped, at least from a social validity standpoint of, hey, maybe they're going to use this in their own lives, which might help them, since it's kind of difficult for us to follow them around and see if they're using it in their situations.
Yeah,
it's kind of hard
exactly.
to actually get any direct observation type data. So that was one way we tried to get at least some validity from them, that they learned the process and they were hopefully using it in their own situations. Yeah.
So that's neat. So it wasn't really about. So it was okay for if sort of the solution they came up with might not have been great.
It is.
And so if they came up with a solution that in the end, would not help would not solve the problem, you weren't giving them feedback to sort of change their decision.
Not really, no. So most of any of that might happen when you're actually talking about advantages and disadvantages. But they might make the wrong decision. And we see that often when we work with youth who we do the SOTOS process with. It was developed actually for the TIP model, the transition, it's a transition
to independence.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Transition independence model that Rusty Clark kind of developed that model, and they're training it across the country. I think he even goes to Canada actually to do some training on this model for actually youth who are anywhere from like 18 to 25, like young, who also might have emotional behavior disorders, and to kind of help them in their decision-making processes to make better decisions. But they have to own the decision. And so it's not something, because we can tell them what to do all day long. Are they going to do it? Probably not. So it's more a matter of getting them to kind of think through their decisions a little bit more and think about the different advantages and disadvantages. So hopefully it makes them come up with a better decision in the end. But us telling them what to do is, we know that doesn't work really well.
Right, of course. The second secret word is run. And so did you find that folks, that maybe initially, it didn't work for them, would still try it again? Like they were that, even though maybe the first decision they made might not have been the greatest, they were still willing to try it again?
Yeah, I mean, the prior research has shown that the process is pretty effective. There's been a few other studies out there on the TIP model and also the SOTOS process in general with youth. I think this is the only study that we did related to adults who were homeless. And so we wouldn't really have that information because we were only getting the feedback from when they potentially attempted to use it. But I don't think, I don't recall, I don't think we asked them, if it didn't work well, what did you do? Did you change what you did or anything like that? We only got the information back from them. Yeah.
And were these folks that were like currently homeless, or were they like staying in a shelter, or like how did you access them?
They were currently in an apartment that was subsidized by the local church. So they weren't having to pay for it. It was subsidized. So they had to earn their way kind of in there into that apartment. So they had to be off of substances and also looking for work or working at least a little bit to be able to stay there. I mean, they could earn it getting in there, but then in order to stay, they have to, do some things to be able to stay in that type of housing.
Right. So homeless, I guess maybe this kind of goes back to what is homelessness. Right. Homelessness doesn't necessarily mean you're living on the streets.
True. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it just means you don't have your own home. Is that essentially the definition? Or
yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it could be you're in a shelter placement, you're kind of going, or even like couch surfing to different people's homes that it could be a variety of things. Living in a car. Yeah.
I really loved and the piece about this where you actually got the adults to teach other adults who are homeless. I don't suppose there was was there any way to sort of look at those folks? Or
I wish we could have. We didn't in this study. It'd be awesome to do that in the future, to see if they were able to actually go out and help somebody else. They commented on like, hey, I talked to my friend and told him to do such and such, or told him he needs to think about this a little differently. And so they did comment a little bit on that, but we didn't actually assess that or go out and take data on that.
I just think what an amazing way to sort of apply like the pyramid model
Mhm.
to, you know, the actual sort of subjects of whatever intervention you're looking at.
Yeah,
So you have homeless folks helping other homeless folks. You have, you know, peers helping peers, and, you know, sort of so on and so forth. I just think that could be really, really
it
cool.
could. Yeah.
Yeah, really neat. Um, that's cool. And so can we just shift briefly and talk about that other study that we kind of just touched on before we kind of pressed record, that you in terms of kind of working with, you did some work with, I guess was it homeless kids?
Yeah,
for that
yeah.
one?
So there's a location called Metropolitan Ministries here in Tampa, and they provide a lot of services to families who are in need of homes, of support. And so they have a facility that's a shelter facility in Tampa for homeless families to come and stay there for a certain period of time while they're looking for work, and they can get a variety of other services while they're there. And they also have a school on site. It's a county school for the area, but the kids go to that school, and there's an after school program at that school. The after school program is located like right there on site. And they actually have a behavior analyst who works in the after school program part time. And we're doing some current work there too, but we also had a study that was published where we were trying to help some of those kids learn some social skills. One thing that some kids who are homeless may lack certain types of social skills and how to interact and so forth. And so one of my master's thesis students who was there, she was placed there for her practicum site, and was really interested in helping some of those kids learn some skills. And so she came across a application. It's an app that might teach social skills, and she wanted to try to see if that might work. And so she did that, but then she ended up having to combine it with behavior skills training to actually get it to work. And so what she did was had Confederates come into the environment. Fortunately, these kids are used to other kids coming into the after school program, so it wasn't like weird that someone would come in and introduce themselves. And so one of the skills was just introducing. So when someone comes up and says, "Hi, my name's so-and-so," to teach them how to say, "Oh, well, my name's blah, blah, blah," and respond. And then one of the other skills was how to make a nice comment. And this is where a person might say, you know, I got this new watch today, and have the kids comment on saying something like, "Oh, that's really nice. I like your new watch. It's really cool," or whatever. So trying to teach them how to respond to something. And then I think the other skill was sharing that we taught. Within that setting was how you might share with another kid in a situation and how you would go about doing that. And so she did that with those kids and was able to increase their ability to do those three specific social skills that were part of this one online social skills curriculum. Now the curriculum itself didn't work them just going through the curriculum. It was a online kind of a curriculum where they went through, answered some questions, learned about the social skill, but then they actually needed the role playing and the behavioral skills training to actually learn how to do it when a Confederate would come and approach them. And so we did those kind of in situ probes where we had someone approaching them to see if it would actually work once we trained it.
The third secret word is Florida. And so, social skills are good to have for anyone. Do you think that having these social skills would help them to sort of to not be homeless?
I don't know about that. Probably not, because it's not their fault that they're homeless since they're kids. These are elementary school kids.
Fair enough. So these are kids that are homeless because their parents are homeless, sort of thing, and gotcha.
Yeah, so their family is living there because of whatever situation is happening with their parents.
Right.
But given the situation that was with the parents, there's a good chance that they're not. They may not even be attending school regularly before they came into the shelter. They may be lacking some of the skills that they might need. And so we just approach it with, well, what are a few different skills we could teach to try to help them? But they certainly would need more than just those skills. But that was kind of the first start of it. But they are getting other services there. And there's an after school program in which we're training the teachers in how to use Class Dojo to try to help with behavior issues that are happening in the after school program. And, a variety of things. There's a couple different curriculums they're using in that program to help them also gain, different skills.
No, that makes sense. And learning to make friends isn't going to get you a home or get your parents a home.
It can help you
but it is
in general.
It can help you, and it also, I think, it's not so much about, I don't think services for homeless kids are about helping them get a home. It's that's what you're working with the parents for. For these kids, it's about, by being homeless, they're also, they also lack opportunities to
For
just
sure.
have a general education in anything, and so any skills that we can give them can help them kind of be more resilient as they
For
grow
sure, because
older.
these might
So
help them make friends, keep friends, that sort of thing.
So you talked about using BST. I'm going to take a slight tangent for the listeners,
Sure.
and just talk about one more paper that you did that just again, if I have any folks in the audience that actually listen to more than one episode of my podcast, and thank you if you do, but you probably started to notice that I go on a lot of different tangents, and because the way I sort of recruit guests for the podcast is usually based on just the research I kind of find them doing, and articles that look really cool. And sometimes I find folks are doing research that isn't always directly related to everything else they're doing. And so the topic shifts quite a few times. And this one's no different. And it's so rare that I see, articles on bullying that aren't sort of school centered, number one, and two, that actually have an actual sort of skills component. So usually bullying interventions, and I shouldn't say usually, my little experience with bullying interventions, they seem to be more like that kind of online social skills group you talked about, or where they're just kind of putting people through curriculum, or saying it's like say no and go and tell someone you trust, and all those commercials that they used to have when we were kids, and stop, drop, and roll, or whatever, to sort of here's what you should do, but to actually kind of get in there and do it with them. And so you had done this article, I think it was just a couple of years ago, on an intervention called response to bullying. Can you, and in that you use BST, but then I see that you also use something called IST, and I often have seen those abbreviations in similar papers whenever Dr. Ray Miltenberger writes something.
Yep.
And I noticed, and so I wasn't surprised to see he was one of the authors on this study. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the study,
Sure.
but also about kind of what the difference is between BST and IST.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, so this study took forever to get through our internal review board. So
they always do, yeah. I imagine.
So, well, I'm sure many of you who are listening, who work out in group home settings for adults, and I used to work in some group home settings for adults years ago, know that sometimes they're not very nice to each other. Some of the people living in those settings, they're mean. They say rude things to each other or mean things to each other. And so that's kind of what was happening at this group home place that we went and did this study. Gotcha. And it was one of my thesis students was at this group home, and she's like, gosh, these guys are just so mean to each other. Can we figure out a way to get them to stop saying, mean things and bullying each other? And so that's kind of where the idea came across. And so this was a group facility. It had like 3 little homes on the campus, and it was only for men. And it was actually for men who had previous instances of kind of inappropriate sexual behavior.
Gotcha.
But they were all living at this, and we weren't focused on that behavior, but they were all living at this particular group home, and they ranged really from kind of mild developmental disabilities to, I would say, moderate. So this wasn't like really severe. These guys were talking to each other. Many of them they went to a workplace off campus and so forth. They could go to the store with staff, buy things and so forth. So just to get an idea of kind of their functioning level. And so we ended up recruiting three of the men. 2 of them had mild developmental disabilities, and one was kind of more along the lines of moderate developmental disabilities. And so what we were thinking was, well, what can we do? What do we think is the function here? And we mainly think the function's probably attention. Wouldn't necessarily have to be, but we're thinking they're probably getting a lot of attention. So the person who's bullying somebody, the person who's getting bullied, the victim, is responding to it. yelling back at them, creating, a situation where it's arguing back and forth. So there's a lot of attention going on to this. So could we do something to decrease this, attention that's provided? And maybe if we did that, we could decrease the bullying. And so we created this kind of response to bullying where we would teach victims. So these 3 guys that we recruited were getting bullied quite often at these group homes. Good. And so what if we teach them what to do? So when someone comes up and says something rude to you or mean, threatens you, whatever, because there was stuff like, I'm going to go dig a hole and bury you in it or whatever, stuff like that. What can they do? So what we did is taught them to first, the step 1 was refrain from retaliating. So don't say anything, don't do anything, because sometimes they would get physical, hit them and so forth. You want to not say anything or not get physical with them and not retaliate, basically. The step 2 was you could say a short statement of disapproval, like, I don't like that. And so we asked each of the guys that we worked with, what is your statement going to be? So they could pick it out. And it was something similar to that. Like, I don't like that. That's not nice. And then they were supposed to walk away. That was step 3. So it's refrain from retaliating, state a short comment of disapproval, walk away. And then the 4th step was tell a staff member. And we can talk about that a little later, but tell somebody about it. You can see these are kind of similar to some of the other work that Dr. Miltenberger has done with like gun safety, abduction prevention, and things like that. Yeah, related to the steps. Yes. But we kind of just took that and applied it to bullying, which is why we did have him help us kind of set this up. Very similar to some of his other work. And so we use behavior skills training to train these participants, the guys, to do this. And so we would say a bully statement to them. We'd have them practice what they're supposed to do when that happens, and so forth. And so then we had Confederates. And so we trained other individuals who had developmental disabilities, but these guys were guys who used to be in this setting, but were now out independent living. So they're guys with developmental disabilities, but they're living in independent living, but they know the guys that we're working with. They know our participants because they do outings together. They go to like the bowling alley, other things together. So they knew who they were. So they weren't like somebody who would just come into the environment not knowing, because that'd be kind of odd to have somebody come in and bully you when you don't know them, kind of thing. So we trained the Confederates, these guys who were in independent living, to come in and actually say a bully statement to our participants, so that we could see, would they actually do the response we trained them? Otherwise, how would we know if they do it? Sure, we could bully them all day long, but they're going to do it with us. But will they actually do it in a situation, a real situation, where they think they're in the real situation and they don't know that this person is part of the study? So you can see now why it took forever to get through internal review board, because of all the potential issues with, someone coming in and bullying somebody else. Yeah, and so forth. So yeah, it took forever to get through there. We actually designed it as a multiple probe study because we wanted to have the least number of probes of this to happen. But the internal review board said you got to run one participant completely through so we can make sure nobody's going to get hurt, injured before you can do the next 2. So we had to change it to a multiple baseline design, which then we had to do more probes, which actually made it a more dangerous kind of study. But I won't even go into that. Yeah. But anyway, so we did this design. So it was a multiple baseline design. So in baseline, the Confederate would come in, say the bully statement, we'd record what the participant did. And the Confederate had specific instructions to come in, kind of interact for a couple of seconds or whatever, and then say a bully statement. And within 5 seconds after saying it, they were supposed to leave the area so they didn't get hit or injured. They weren't supposed to talk back and so forth. But we were recording, well, what did the victim say? Our participant, did they say, that's not that nice? Did they yell at them? What did they do in baseline? And then we trained them with behavior skills training to respond using this response to bullying, and then recorded when the Confederate came in, what they did. And we did see that, so BST was effective for 2 of the participants, although one of the participants needed IST, so in situ training. So basically what that is so they got the BST training. Now, in the moment when that Confederate came in and bullied and they didn't do the response correctly, then one of the researchers would jump in, come out of nowhere, basically, and stop the situation and say, oh, let's do this again. So what's supposed to happen when someone comes and bullies you? What are you supposed to do? Yeah, we're supposed to do this. And then we practice it 3 times. So that's kind of what in situ training is. It's practicing the right response of what should have happened in that situation. And so that worked for one participant. However, the last participant needed actually an incentive. So we did BST, IST, and they still weren't implementing it until we offered an incentive for if they were bullied, they could earn something for engaging in the correct response. And we got it to increase, I think, to a 3 out of 4 steps. I forget which step that participant was missing. And that participant was the one that had the more moderate level disabilities. And he would often comment that, well, that person wasn't bullying me. They're really a nice person, kind of thing. And may have struggled like interpreting the bully response for that person. So could have been what happened. And then one of the other participants would only get to 3 steps, which was kind of understandable because he'd tell us, well, why do I have to tell the staff person? They're right over there watching. Which I didn't think they did see it, because that was the other thing. The IRB made us have to have a staff person within so many feet of this happening in case something went down and they had to intervene. So in some ways that particular participant was correct. It's like the staff person saw it, so why do I have to go tell them?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So was there... Did you get to see at that point then if it was effective with the actual roommates?
Yeah. No. So we didn't actually. So the problem with actually evaluating this, which is why we had Confederates, because otherwise we kind of have to sit around all day and wait for somebody to bully somebody else. So we didn't do that, but we did actually get some feedback from the participants and also from the group home staff saying that they saw them using this, and the participants said, yeah, they think it was helpful, that this person doesn't bully them as much now when they walk away. Things like that we got from our social validity statement. But I wish we could have. It's just a matter of you'd have to sit around all day and wait for something to happen and see if they respond. And then if you're sitting there watching, they might... that's one of the issues with if we're observing and present in the room, is they might react differently just because we're there. So it was really clear that we weren't in the room when the Confederates came in. We had a camera kind of off-site, like off hiding, to get that information. So that's why we incorporated the Confederates, to make sure they would do it when we're not there.
And did these folks, these victims, quote unquote, they're obviously get used to being bullied by their roommates. Did they understand that these Confederates were faking it?
They did not know that, no. But we did have to debrief them after the study. And so after the study, the Confederates and the so this was part of the internal review board made us do this, but we got at it anyway, where we put them together in a room and we made it really clear to the participant that we asked the Confederate to do this. The Confederate is not a mean person, whatever. We went over this. And then had the Confederates apologize, say, I was part of the study, I was only doing it because they told me to do it, whatever, things like that. We basically debriefed them at the end, both the Confederates and the participants. And we also trained the Confederates on how to respond if they were ever bullied.
It reminds me of an episode of What Would You Do?
Oh yeah,
you know that show? Yeah, where the cameras come out and they all explain.
Yeah, it is kind of like that.
Nice people, and we don't actually do this sort of thing. Just with it, so. And it would make sense with sort of the type of studies Milton Berger does with guns and and sexual abuse and those sorts of things, where obviously you could only ever do those studies with Confederates. You're never going to have a real gun, or you're never going to have actual sexual abuse or anything like that. And I don't know if you know the answer to this question or not, but I'm just sort of thinking for my own practice, and sort of trying to do more of this IST stuff, because we've been trying to incorporate this a little bit, and it's easier we're doing it in kind of staff training, which is a lot easier to do because it's sort of staff working with staff, and that's easy enough. But do folks ever do sort of in situ training with without Confederates?
I would think so. Yes. I mean, there's no reason that you couldn't. I mean, I think it's normally. I mean, the studies that Dr. Milton Berger does, he has Confederates that are coming into the situation, he has researchers come into the situation and do the IST, but parents have been taught how to do in situ training in his studies. So a parent can come in if they don't touch if they touch the gun, a parent comes in and tells them, hey, what are we supposed to do instead? Or with medication or whatever. So for sure, anybody could be taught how to do in situ training, because you could teach, a teacher in a situation where if that teacher witnesses bullying happening, to come in and quickly train either the victim or the bully, depending on what you're training, on how to respond in that situation. So there's no reason that couldn't happen. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's cool. Really cool. Well, really neat. I think it's just kind of cool to see, this kind of work being done with, these really kind of super vulnerable populations. I mean, I think you're I don't know if lucky is the right word, but maybe just really good at grant writing to sort of get, financial support to do this kind of work. Have you found sort of any of these things being now being used by some of these agencies now that you're kind of out of the picture, or
yeah, the runaway stuff is, I get probably at least a couple emails every month about people wanting that, because right now we only publish the assessment, the interview, but we have an entire intervention guide that I need to publish, and so I'll send that off.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so that way different folks can use both of those materials. And there's a variety of people across the country using those, but behavior analysts and also social workers and case managers who are using some of those assessments and interventions for when they work with kids who are running away. There's a couple of different sites that I work with directly in different places in the United States that are using that. And even still in Florida too, we're still doing that. So that's being used. And the SOTAS process is being used in a variety of different types of interventions. The response to bullying, I'm not sure. Hopefully some folks are picking that up. I have gotten a number of emails about that study and questions. And so I think people are starting to look at that and might be using it in some of the work they're doing. We wanted to do another study with preschoolers related to bullying. And that one we were going to actually observe and try to see it happen on the playground and be able to intervene right away. But then COVID hit and we kind of got, kind of sidelined for a while to do that. But we're hoping to do some more stuff in that. Bullying is hard because it is a lot like, gun safety and other things where if you're present, then it might not happen. It's going to happen when adults aren't present. Same with running away. So it's just a difficult behavior to try to, study and actually collect data.
Yeah. Well, no, and the bullying one I think works really well in kind of those, like particularly the study in that group home context. I mean, I think that's an ideal sort of scenario to kind of do this kind of intervention, because you are sitting, the staff are available, to be, they're right there, and the sort of the people doing it are right there. Like it's just a nice sort of microcosm that I think you can really do some kind of cool stuff with if you were just a group home manager running it versus a researcher like yourself having to get approval from boards and whatnot, whereas they could just kind of do it and then see if the the residents have those responses. The reason I asked the question is I think it just seems like all of the work that you've done here is really sort of easily kind of replicable by kind of non-behavior analytic professionals. I mean, these are not difficult studies, certainly difficult studies to get off the ground for all those obvious sort of bureaucratic barriers and ethical barriers and whatnot. But the actual sort of idea of sort of whether it's for the runaway assessment, just asking the right questions and then making some changes, or SOTAs, which is just a really standard sort of way of making decisions. I think these are really, really nice examples of research that can be easily sort of applied in kind of regular environments. I just think that's really cool, and I hope other folks will take some of this stuff and kind of do that. So what's next on in the project list for you, Kim?
Well, I have a current grant right now, which is It's a Department of Education grant, and it's actually to try to work with teachers in self-contained classrooms of students with emotional behavior disorders to implement class-wide interventions to try to increase engagement in class and decrease problem behavior, but implementing kind of class-wide, those tier 2 kind of interventions is what we're working on now. But it's been a struggle for the grant got funded a year ago, and because schools right now, trying to get into schools with COVID has been a bit of a strain. So we're working on it though. Absolutely. So we're doing that work. Yeah. So there's that going on, and some other things related to schools, but then we're also doing still doing the runaway stuff with a couple of agencies, and working on some stuff within a group facility that we have in foster care we're actually trying to do something to increase, it's kind of like an OBM project to try to get staff to come in on time and to decrease staff turnover and try to figure out how can we change that at this particular facility, because they're having huge turnover, which is partially a COVID issue, but also just what happens at some of these facilities. So how can we, get some things lined up to help increase staff retention? We're working on.
Cool. Really good. Cool. Well, thanks again for just being on the podcast.
Sure.
Sharing your really neat work and really cool.
If any of your listeners want more information on any of these studies, just tell them to reach out to me. I can send them anything they might be interested in. Happy to do so.
Absolutely. Yeah. We'll put your email list in the show notes, and as well as, links to all the articles and all that kind of good stuff. So really cool. Thanks again.
Of course. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Cheers.